we ready to begin?
Chair Templeton,
Here?
Vice Chair Rupavar,
Present. Present.
Commissioner Ochek,
Present.
Commissioner Heckman. Commissioner Heckman? Is he here?
He's here. Let me just go see what's up.
We'll come back to him. Commissioner Lowing,
Present.
Commissioner Riggs is absent. Commissioner Suma,
Present.
We can wait a minute. Yeah, he'll be here in a moment. Or do you want to just continue? Okay. All right, we are all here now and ready to begin.
Great, so we don't have any, I think, do you want us to begin with oral communications if there's anybody here to speak with anything that's not on the agenda?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. So I have a few agenda cards from people wanting to speak to agendized items. If you're here to speak about something that's not on the agenda, please let us know now. Okay.
Thank you. So I would like to give a little, we don't have any agenda changes, additions, or deletions, but I will offer a brief director's report for this month. So one exciting thing, and if you haven't received it already in your email, we'll make sure that you do get a posting that we have for a land use planner. So if you know any great land use planners out there, please encourage them to apply to work here for the city of Palo Alto. This position would focus a lot on data and analysis. And so while the ideal candidate may have a planning background, really we're looking for folks who have experience with GIS mapping and geography kind of data software, as well as any other data analysis software. We can teach them the planning and land use part, but we really want somebody who can get in, help us to do a better job of understanding what's going on in our community, provide the data and analysis that our community expects. So if you know any great candidates, please send them our way. We're also happy to announce that Palo Alto was selected as one of 7 jurisdictions to participate in what's called the Challenge Grant. And so there's a consortium of funders known as Partnership for the Bay's Future who've gotten together to raise money to deal a lot with different issues in the Bay Area, but primarily with housing. So they've established a couple funds. One of the funds is dedicated to helping support the preservation and construction of affordable housing in the Bay Area, and they've made about $30 million worth of awards to, I think, 8 projects across the Bay Area. And another fund that they've developed is the Policy Fund, which is to support, in this particular instance, mid-career fellows for 2 years at local jurisdictions, mostly cities, but also, I believe, Alameda County, so it's county government as well, to look at renter protections. How can we help to preserve our renter community in different cities throughout the Bay Area? So Palo Alto applied for this grant. We were successful, and we're happy to announce that at the end of February, our mid-career fellow will be starting here in Palo Alto, and she'll be with us here for 2 years. So we're very excited to be part of this program. Some neighboring communities that are part of it, East Palo Alto, Redwood City, City of San Jose, Alameda County, City of Berkeley, and there's a couple other jurisdictions that I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's definitely a great cohort, and we'll also be participating in events with those other cities quarterly and annually to learn more about what other cities are doing. So it's definitely a really great thing, and hopefully more good policy that will come before you, as well as the City Council, and perhaps opportunity for future grant funds. So very excited about that. And lastly, I believe it was just last week, might have been the week before, Director Late was at the City Council presenting the 2020 Housing Work Plan. So hopefully you were able to catch some of that on TV, or maybe you were there in person, and if not, you can at least see the action minutes. So one of the big outcomes of that meeting was the motion by Mayor Fine and seconded and approved by the council unanimously to reauthorize planned communities. And so not necessarily just resurrecting the planned communities of the past, but really it's called planned home zoning. So really trying to focus on the housing as a major community benefit, not necessarily some of the other items that had been negotiated in past planned communities. And with a caveat that if there's any office, if it's a mixed-use development that doesn't include just housing, that the housing that's built would balance out any of the net new office. So essentially, if you're creating X jobs, that would result in X housing units, that all of those housing units are provided on that site. And obviously, we know people who work there may or may not live there, but the idea is we're not worsening our jobs, housing, and balance as we are permitting mixed-use developments. The motion also included looking at public land to use for affordable housing, thinking about our staffing and resources in planning and development services, and thinking about even referring to Finance Committee proposal to consider affordable housing tax. In addition, in the report itself, there are, I believe, 28 different items that are already part of what the department is working on. And so those are organized in order of priority. So items 1 through 12 are what we're really trying to tackle this year. Those are items that will be coming before this body in some form as we are moving through them, as we are making proposed changes to the municipal code. So you will see those items coming this year, and one of the items you can look forward to before the summertime would be changes to our accessory dwelling unit, or ADU ordinances. We did make some urgency ordinances in January just to make sure that with state law coming in, we were able to maintain those parts of our ordinance that state law didn't come and supersede. But these changes that we'll be bringing forward will really be tailored to Palo Alto to think about how can we continue to encourage ADU production here, which, as you'll see in our report tonight about housing, is a big important component of our housing production and meeting our regional housing needs allocation. So that's my report. Amy, I don't know if there's anything else in the department that I've forgotten, but and if there's any questions, we're happy to answer commissioner questions.
Any questions? Somebody's pressed a button here. No, mistake. Okay. All right. Thank you for that update. That's exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing those priorities come before the commission. All right. So shall we move ahead to item number 2?
So item number 2, we have here tonight, I'll do part of the presentation. Unfortunately, one of our staff planners also came down with a fever and is out sick today. So she created the presentation and the report, but is not able to be here to present that. And that's Chitra Motra, which Doria will remember her from our NVCAP meeting. So, and then we also have Margaret Monroe. She is here. She's one of our planners as well, who will be presenting on the housing portion of the plan. Let me just get oriented here. So the purpose of this report and this proposal is to comply with our state requirements that really require that each year we would put an annual report to the legislative body, the Office of Planning and Research, and the Department of Housing and Community Development about both our comp plan, so reviewing what's the progress we've made on our comprehensive plan, and then also our housing element, what is the progress that we've made on our housing element. Now, the comprehensive plan includes the housing element, but the housing element, as you may know, is updated on a more regular cycle than the comprehensive plan is required by state law, and the requirements for reporting are a little bit different. But we wanted to bring both of the reports before you tonight, since again, they're both about our long-range planning and looking annually at how the progress is going. And one important thing is that these reports are due by April 1st, so we're here a little bit early as you guys consider tonight, and if you do recommend approval onto council, council will consider this, recommend approval, and then we would submit those reports to the state. So again, the purpose, again, focusing on the comp plan and then the progress towards our housing element goals, but it also includes progress towards our regional housing needs allocation. Overall, in summary, for our 2030 comprehensive plan implementation, the plan itself included 410 programs. So again, long range, looking big picture, that's a lot of programs, 410 programs. And so 18% of those have been completed or are partially complete, which makes sense. A lot of these programs are ongoing things that we will be continuing to do through the duration of the comprehensive plan. And so some of the maybe shorter term and medium term things have been completed. When we look at our housing element, we see that the city is 62% of the way through its housing element cycle. So it was a 2015 to 2023 cycle. And so we're 62% of the way through. And you'll see if you jump down to bullet 3, the last bullet 4, we're 78% completed on those programs. So we're actually making really good progress on our housing element in terms of tracking the time elapsed and the completion of the projects. Of course, as you know, thinking about the housing work plan, for example, just a few weeks ago, there are items that we begin to tackle that aren't necessarily reflected in our element because we're keeping up with the day-to-day, and the element was passed in 2015. So still seeing if we can figure out a way to get credit for stuff that we didn't put in our element that we're doing, but we haven't figured that out quite yet. And Meg will go into more detail about some of the housing numbers, those 107 units that we've created in Palo Alto or permitted in the last year. So within the comprehensive plan, these are the different elements and programs that we have: land use, transportation, natural environment, safety, community facilities, services and facilities, business and economics, and governance, and that totals 410 programs. And then there's additional 72 programs that are part of the housing element. In the 2 years since the adoption of the comprehensive plan, there are a number of ongoing, partially complete, and pending programs. And so you can see the breakdown here: 8% are complete, 233 are ongoing, that's the bulk of them. Some, 10% are partially complete, and some that are pending, which means we are waiting to begin and initiate those programs. So now I'm going to pass it over to Margaret Monroe, and she is going to talk about the housing element.
Thank you. Before I get into this, I want to reiterate that we are actually talking about 2 state requirements that you're looking at tonight. One is the annual progress report for the comprehensive plan, of which the housing element is a part. And what you have as Appendix B on your staff report is the housing element part of the OPR report. Then there's a second report that goes to the Housing and Community Development Department, which is the adoption, and they're tracking our production against our RHNA number, our regional housing number. And this is simply a numeric analysis. They tell us, here's the information we want, and we fill that in, and I think that they ultimately come out with a big state document saying this is what the world has done in 2019. This is the 5th year of our cycle, so you'll see on some of these tables that we go 2015 to 2019 and look at the total, because they're comparing us to our production against where we are in the cycle. So this first table, I'm sure you're probably all familiar with it, is what our regional allocation is currently, and it's divided for HCD's reporting purposes. Very low and extremely low income units are combined together. So you may have seen this number in a slightly different way, but for their reporting, they ask that those 2 are combined. This table, which is a little hard to see, unfortunately, is the building activity that we've had to produce net new units since 2015. This number is based on permits issued. These numbers may not quite jive with other numbers you've seen because frequently production is based on occupancy permits, in other words, things that are actually completed in their construction, or other measures. But in the case of state reporting, they want this based on building permit activity, building permits issued. At the time of issuance, they consider the unit to be in place. And you'll see all these numbers compare on that basis, and you'll see that our largest area of contribution is in above moderate income category, and if you look at the production numbers for 2019, more than half of those are ADUs. So, and you can also see there was also an impact of ADUs in 2018, but a big impact, about 58% of those units were ADUs in 2019. Whoop, did it change? Yes, it did. This gives us the comparison. Remember I said there's a benchmark. They're looking at where we are in the cycle. So this shows where we are relative to our benchmark of about 62%. We are above our production projection and above moderate, and we are below in all of the other in very low, low, and moderate income units. This section really addresses the housing element programs. There's 72 programs. Of the 72 programs, we have accomplished 78%, which is more than our 62% benchmark. And when you look at these numbers, you say, wait a minute, Meg, it doesn't quite work out that way. Ongoing and completed are considered to be completed units. In other words, those are programs that have been established and they're ongoing, have been since 2015 or whenever they were initiated, and then completed are ones that have actually been completed. We have 11 underway, and we have 5 that are not completed, we haven't yet initiated. Those programs, you'll find the underway programs and the ones that haven't been initiated yet are addressed in the housing work program that the council looked at on February 3rd, and they would be in that priority list that was discussed. And the last item here is the list of upcoming housing element programs, and these are the ones that are addressed in the work program, or will be addressed in the city's work programs in between now and 2023. And actually, we're down to just 5. And there are things that I'm sure you're aware of, like pedestrian-oriented and transit-oriented development, looking at transit-rich housing sites for future development, reviewing the zoning code and permits for innovative housing types, and development and preservation of group homes and support living facilities for persons with special needs. So those are things that, and I think you'll find these, many of these echoed in Jonathan's work program. So that brings us to our conclusion, and that is the action that you need tonight. And it's to review the reports and supporting documentation and recommend approval to the City Council. And when we say reports, we mean both the one to go to OPR, which includes your Table A in your staff report and Table B regarding the housing element, and then the report to HCD. And you should have at your desks some oversized pages, which even then you can hardly read. That's the format that we submit to HCD, and those are the drafts that have the current data in them if you are interested in that. So I'll be happy to answer any questions, as I'm sure Rachel will.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you both for that report. We can do any questions on the content, but we should also ask if there's any public comment on this topic. Anyone have public comment for item number 2 that was just presented by staff? No? All right. So we're going to try lighting up our lights to see if anyone has any comments or questions on this presentation.
Are they working?
Okay, lighting up lights works. Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. There we go. Still learning, still learning. I wanted to clarify, we received a report just now on the housing side. We have 2 analyses, two tables, right? And I actually had some comments on the first table, which is the comprehensive plan, not the housing elements. Sure. Are we going to receive a staff report on that, or not, unless we ask questions?
The staff report for the comprehensive plan is the report that you have, and then the table is the table that would be submitted to OPR. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Page 17.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
No, you're right. I did receive that staff report. I was wondering if there was any additional information staff wanted to give us on Table A before I give my comments.
Well, it's a very exhaustive table, so we
Yes,
did
it
not
is.
cherry pick any of the 410 programs to highlight, but if there are questions that you have, I guess what I can say a little bit about the plans creation, or the plans creation, but the tables creation. So these 410 programs, as you can imagine, I mean, it really is a comprehensive plan, and that's not an understatement for how the Palo Alto's plan is designed. So they are spread across a number of departments and divisions that have responsibility for implementing them. So essentially what we do as planning department, part of our annual report, is to reach out to those departments who have responsibility for these programs to say, hey, what is the status of this plan or program? What's the update? And as reflected, many of them are ongoing. I think a lot of the things that we plan to do are things that we do. And then some things are stretch assignments, right? Things that we want to grow into, and so maybe they're not underway yet, or they're getting going. And so that's where we get a lot of this information. So we will be happy to answer as much as we can about questions with the knowledge that some of these programs, many of them are not managed by the planning department, but we are gathering the data from those departments to report on their progress.
Great, and is that you, Commissioner Lowing? Did you have a question? Oh, you're not?
No.
Oh.
No, I was just making sure I had all the information before I asked my questions. So I did on Table A find a few minor non-substantive changes, and I have provided those to staff earlier. I do have a hard copy here, and I'm not sure what to do with it, but we can get it in the record however we do that. Again, they're non-substantives. I just had a couple of questions on Table A.
Yep.
And the first one is on the first page of the table, which is packet page 17. There's a column called level of effort with and in that column we see dollar signs.
Yeah.
1, 2, and I think there might be some, I can't remember if I saw some $3 signs. Yeah, I did. So, but in the staff report, I didn't see an explanation of that, so I might have missed it, but can somebody tell me what that column is communicating?
Yes, so the intent of that, and that's very good to point out that we need to have the key for the dollar signs added, and I'm making a note of that, just as we have the key for the other items that are there. It's to indicate an order of magnitude, the cost that might be incurred with that program. And still, with that being said, some of it, when it's ongoing, may be able to be performed within the existing resources that we have. Kind of as the order of magnitude increases, that we may need to put more effort or dedicate more resources that might be new resources in order to accomplish that. Or it could be one time if it's a capital project, but would need an injection of funds in order to realize that program.
Okay, and then are those dollar signs, are those universal throughout the state? Or is that something
That's
that
a
we
good
created?
question. I don't think that is universal, but I should ask on that. I think it might be something that we've used locally here.
Okay, the reason, what I was thinking is that in your staff report, we have, you've defined all of the other, like, for example, the priority lettering, S, I, IP, M, S. But if those are not used statewide, then my suggestion was at the top of this first page of the table, we provide a full key that tells the state what we mean by every one of our abbreviations or symbols. Again, if the state already knows that because we're using the same things that every city is, then I don't think that's necessary.
Great, thank you.
And I just had one other one on page 26, just a question. And I don't know if we have the staff here to answer tonight, but it's on item L9.11.2. Utilities and planning are in the process of identifying potential city-owned properties and facilities for future wireless communication facilities and advanced metering infrastructure equipment. I just was wondering if the staff was here knowing when the ETA for that was.
We probably can't address that when Rebecca Atkinson is here tonight for a wireless item. I believe this is something that we have been doing already to look at city facilities, and also we already encourage wireless carriers to try to co-locate facilities where they can. it's not required. They have to obviously work with the building owner and et cetera, et cetera. But there are downtown, for example, several places where there are co-located facilities, especially in our taller buildings where it's a little bit harder to see or to be intrusive. So with the city-owned properties specifically, that work has been ongoing.
Okay.
I will say some of the work with some of the other wireless work has superseded that, but that is part of council's request that they made of us actually last year as well, to come back and look at where in the city and city-owned facilities could wireless facilities be located.
Okay. Those were my questions, and thank you.
Thank you. All right, Commissioner Lowing.
Yes, I remember, thank you. I remember last year when we went over this, we had some discussion, it's kind of a fine point, but maybe it's a legal point, of whether we're actually approving anything tonight, because these are just reports, and we're not going to discuss it and recommend it and make any changes. So technically, we're just noting that we've seen it, we provided a public hearing for that, and we're sending along, not recommending any deferral or changes. And it's going to consent calendar as well, so.
Yeah, the code requires that there be a public hearing,
Right.
so.
Right, so just by getting this report and having people allowed to speak, we basically sort of allowed that to happen. And so I don't know if we're actually approving it, that's up to you guys, but anyway, I just want to make that point.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that recommending that city council would approve it. I mean, to some degree, especially with the HCD report, they say this is the form you're going to fill out and put the information in, and this is how we want it. So certainly there's very limited room to approve upon their required form. With the comprehensive plan, there's a little bit more wiggle room, but I mean, still they kind of, even with it being just as basic as it is, it's many, many pages of a report, and that's kind of the format that they are wanting. But still, I think even having the suggestions from the commission tonight have already helped to, I think, improve the report and keep fresh for us what we're supposed to be working on, and certainly can be something that we can use to guide our work in the coming year.
Okay, the next one was kind of a looking forward question, which is what's the lead time on the housing element that has to be redone every 3 years? So the question is, when do we
Yeah.
first start working on that to
Yes,
get this thing
indeed.
going?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We really need to work on getting we likely will need some form of help from a consultant of some kind to work with us on our housing element. It's pretty common for cities of our size to engage services for the development of a housing element, so we need to get that secured this year. And then we really need to make sure that we're well underway all of next year developing the housing element.
Okay. One detail on packet page 13, is that really meant to go through December of 19? It says 18. So just wanted to know.
I'm sorry. Which page?
Packet page 13 at the top, it says that these are programs from the 2014 to 2018.
No, it should be 219.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And you already answered one question, which I thought was implied, and that is that all the ADUs are included.
Yes.
Even though we don't really know what they're being used for, they count in housing, so.
They do count, yes, and I think there has been some concern raised of, do we know that people are renting them, or are people just expanding their homes? And I think those are good questions that we would love to know the answer to. We don't have that data available, but it certainly still counts for our RHNA allocation.
Right,
We
okay,
look at net new units.
right, it's a net new unit, definitely. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, I'm happy to entertain a motion.
Okay, I'll move to accept it, whatever that is, approval, or we noted it, or whatever, but I would move to accept the
Any
report.
seconds? Commissioner Suma, all right. All in favor? All right, this motion passes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Meg. Thank you.
Can we just clarify that? I just wanted to clarify for the record, because we are going to reflect the action in the minutes, that the motion was to move the staff recommendation. Yes, thank you.
Correct.
Okay, before we head on to agenda item 3, I wanted to ask if anyone has any comments about recusals. Yes? Is that? My buttons are not quite lined up yet. Did you have a comment? Okay. So Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. So this is actually on agenda item 3, just before we move to the substance. And it relates to a conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest disclosure. Potential conflicts of interest, I think are very serious, and I take them seriously. I think it's actually one of the most important functions that our citizens can perform in this public process is to raise these issues where they believe they exist, because if they don't put a voice to them, then we can't talk about them. And so, as it happens, a member of one of our residents has raised this issue about me as it relates to the wireless industry, and so I appreciate them bringing forward their concerns, and I particularly appreciate that they did so in a tactful and respectful manner, and I would hope that that's how these issues would be brought up. So there are two types of conflicts of interest potential. Financial interest and bias, and I intend to address both of them. So I'm a land use attorney. I've been doing this for more than 30 years, and along the way, I have done work for the telecommunications industry. Specifically, I worked for a substantial period of time for one of the largest industry companies, and my primary job was to attend public hearings, like planning commissions, and seek approval of permits. So that they could get approved and build wireless communication facilities. But the last time I did any of that work was at least a decade ago, and probably more like 15 years ago or more. I'm in a small firm, and another attorney in my firm also has done that kind of work with the industry, but she has not done any work with the industry in a number of years. So California law provides that a conflict of interest exists if I have a financial interest in the outcome, and it imputes to me any income that my firm has earned from the industry or from anybody who would have an interest in our wireless ordinance in the last 12 months. So I have not. There is no such income, and so under that test, I have no conflict of interest. The other aspect, potential conflict of interest, is bias. And the concern was raised in this letter that because of my prior involvement with the industry and the prospect that at some point in the future, I or another member of my law firm might be hired by the industry, that I had a bias. In other words, that I could not fairly and impartially decide a matter that was brought to me as item 3 has been. And I think on this issue, I have no bias. I think there may be some confusion of bias with background. The fact that I have experience in the industry is actually an asset, I believe, in processes like this, and I would like to believe that it's this and the experience I have in other land use matters is part of what the council saw in appointing me. So I do have a background, and that doesn't make me predisposed to like their position or dislike their position, but it does allow me to understand their processes and positions. And again, I think that is a useful tool, and it is not a matter of bias. My allegiance is, in my role as a planning commissioner here, is to the city of Palo Alto, and my intention is to make the decisions that are, in my view, are in the best interest of the city and the whole city. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that I'll agree with every comment from every resident every time, but it does mean I will take a big view, and I'm not beholden to the wireless industry. So I don't have a I don't have a conflict of interest on bias. I have conferred with the city attorney's office on both of these matters, and I will be participating fully in tonight's discussion and vote.
All right, thank you. Any other comments on this point? All right, well, thank you, Commissioner Heckman. And we'll proceed, we'll do the staff presentation, then public comment, and then discussion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
All right.
correct. Commissioners, I would like to introduce Rebecca Atkinson. She is a staff planner here with the City of Palo Alto. She's been with us for 5 years, working in both current planning and most recently in long-range planning. She's done a wide variety of applications, including projects at the shopping center, the Stanford University Medical Center. She just helped open that new hospital, so we're very grateful for her work on very complex projects, which includes wireless facilities, a topic that is of interest to many members of our community and that has a very complex regulatory system. So we're really glad to have her here. She's done a lot of work bringing before to the council in December updates to our wireless standards, and tonight before you consideration for changes and amendments to our wireless ordinance. So again, we'll have Rebecca present, maybe if there are clarifying questions, and then public comment, and then to ask the body to deliberate the proposed amendments to our wireless ordinance. Rebecca?
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. We're here tonight to present to you proposed wireless ordinance amendments for PTC review and discussion. We will provide some background information, including an overview of the city's current wireless tools and how these tools fit together to promote the wireless application review process. We will highlight the proposed amendments, including their purpose, timeline, and effect. We will highlight next steps and the staff recommendation. I'd like to note that there is great community interest in all of the city's authority and tools for reviewing wireless applications, and there are likely community members and wireless carriers here tonight to speak to this item. So let's get started on background slides. So existing city wireless communication facility tools. All wireless applications utilize the following 3 tools that are in yellow here. The most frequently looked at tool is the wireless ordinance of PMC section 1842-110, which is for your review and discussion tonight. This section was amended in 2019 and provides the overall wireless regulatory framework, and it's included in your staff report today for reference. Also, we have a series of wireless application checklists that each applicant utilizes to prepare their application materials and subsequently for staff analysis and public review. The other departments, city departments, publish design and construction standards. For example, the trenching locations that Public Works has specified for wireless facility conduit, and the standards specified by our utilities electrical engineering department. Now, we also have additional tools for applications for the public right-of-way, including master license agreements that are agreed to between wireless carriers and the city, and also the objective standards. Summarized here, it's actually Objective Wireless Administrative Standards, a very long title. You have those, a copy of those standards that were most recently adopted by council in December in your staff report as an attachment. For more background, we'd like to highlight the recent activity that many of you and many members of the public and wireless carriers are aware of. Here's a slide showing the timeline of recent activity on the objective wireless standards that I just mentioned. And these standards are for the public right-of-way. And here's the slide for recent city actions on the wireless ordinance. So the last time the Planning Commission saw the ordinance was in 2018 and 2019, and council adopted the current version of the ordinance in April and May. You can see the actual ordinance, and it has the black and white underlined strikeouts, and to distinguish between the ordinance amendments today that are in attachment A. So here we are, we're turning back to the wireless ordinance. To contextualize what's proposed, let's refer to the following slides. The purpose tonight is to respond to council's requested staff review of the ordinance effectiveness and to respond to council and stakeholder ideas and concerns. The timeline is identified by council. Council requested staff to return in April 2020 or earlier. The effect of the proposed amendments is to provide the public more assurance regarding the review of wireless applications and their operations, as well as to establish greater permittee operational accountability. So we received these key topics from council and additional key topics that we'd like to cover tonight. The additional key topics respond to the request for the effectiveness of the ordinance review, as well as topics that were mentioned by stakeholders. So let's go through the proposed amendments. The first item requested by council was additional clarifications regarding infeasibility, exceptions, and alternatives. The amendments that you have before you tonight in attachment A are oriented to encourage applicants to present wireless applications that contain the fewest number of exceptions and to demonstrate why an exception is being requested. In regard to noise, applicants and staff currently address the topic of noise. For example, applicants regularly submit noise reports that are then analyzed by staff for consistency with comprehensive plan noise-related policies, as well as our current noise ordinance. The amendments tonight codify this practice and require ongoing compliance. The third item requested by council was to look at location and design preferences. Tonight, there are no ordinance amendments currently proposed by staff on this topic. And the reason for this include the following items outlined on this slide and in the staff report. Council addressed updates to location design preferences for wireless facilities in the right-of-way by resolution and that they adopted December 16, 2019. And this ordinance, the ordinance already incorporates this resolution by reference. And so you would look at the existing ordinance subsections L2 and M2. Additionally, the ordinance already states the city's overall location and design preferences for wireless facilities to be building mounted and for new wireless facilities to be co-located at existing wireless locations. Other topics include ordinance applicability, and the amendments provide an effective date for all projects. Another topic, application processing procedures. The amendments clarify when applications are considered complete, denied, and withdrawn, and codify staff interpretations. The wireless communication facility application requirements. This subsection already exists, and the amendments codify already existing and standard application checklist items, such as the submittal of planned FCC compliance reports regarding RF emissions and exposure, noise reports, and visual simulations. Use of independent experts. The amendment codifies the current practice of using subject matter experts to review technical reports, such as the applicant-provided planned FCC compliance reports. Generally applicable development standards, again, this subsection already exists, and the amendments are responsive to community feedback and staff experience, such as ensuring that the design of wireless facilities do not interfere with the use of the right-of-way. Conditions of approval. Again, this subsection already exists, and the amendments are responsive to community feedback and staff experience, such as preserving city access and ensuring maintenance of facilities. The last topic is funding for wireless communication facility approval, and these amendments, these subsections already exist, and the amendments clarify current practice regarding the use of the findings for approval. Next steps for tonight is to receive public comments, have a review, discussion, and hopefully a motion. And the staff recommendation is here on the slide and also in your staff report. Adoption of this ordinance would be exempt from environmental review council adoption of this ordinance would be exempt from environmental review. And staff would also like to thank community members and wireless carriers for communicating with staff thus far in the process. And we look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
Commissioner Alchin?
Listen, I'm sorry to say this, but I'm feeling a little under the weather. So I'm going to excuse myself and leave you in your good hands here, and I apologize for that.
All right, thank
But
you.
I think you have a
Take care
quorum,
of
so I
yourself.
think it'll be all right. And I'll see you guys next time we get together.
Great. Feel better. So we have a start for public comment, but I think that new comment cards may have come in. Great, thank you. We'll start with Mr. Alberton and followed by Ms. Cruzen. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Templeton and members of the commission. My name is Paul Albritton. I'm outside counsel for Verizon Wireless, and I'm here with a simple request, and that is that you take a pause and allow the carriers, stakeholders to meet with staff or even with you in some kind of workshop to work on this ordinance. We were working cooperatively with the city, I think up and through last April, and then we really haven't heard from them, haven't heard at all until December when new guidelines came out that were rather shocking to us. And then these further amendments are also shocking. We don't think this code is enforceable, and that's because it establishes prohibitions for facilities adjacent to schools, 20 feet from a building, in any residential zone, and then it requires that we demonstrate an exception for any of those, for putting facilities in any of those prohibited areas, which requires us basically to go through an entire federal law, state law preemption argument showing our coverage objective and the alternatives analysis, not just the analysis, but plans for each alternative. And this is just far beyond what can be required for placing facilities in the public right-of-way. The FCC order that was passed recently required that you establish objective aesthetic reasonable standards, and you did that last April in terms of size. They came through all of you, determining the different dimensions, and stakeholders work with the city to come up with good dimensions. In December, there were suddenly locational standards that were brand new that we'd never seen before. Until that time, they create this huge exception process for us to place the facilities where we plan to place them. It's based on something that people call the Mill Valley model. Mill Valley's ordinance has never been tested, but I know that a lot of residents here have been pushing for these kinds of setbacks. Both AT&T and Verizon Wireless have recently sued Los Altos that adopted a similar type of ordinance that has a school setback. There's no legal justification for the type of school setback that you've got established in your ordinance here. We also recently, I have to say, successfully sued Danville on a similar type of least intrusive means type analysis for small cells. The FCC process is supposed to be 60 days, simple, objective standards that a director can approve, and or not approve, provides predictability to the carrier so that they know whether their application will be approved when it's submitted. San Francisco has a similar objective process. That's the process that was approved in the Supreme Court case T-Mobile versus San Francisco. San Francisco has just moved to a situation where they had no permits, and that's because of their experience of the exhaustion of resources for staff, exhaustion of resources for appeals, exhaustion of resources for council members, didn't go anywhere because there was nothing that they could do to respond to the public fear regarding RF emissions. So I would humbly ask that you please do not adopt or recommend this evening. Request staff to meet with stakeholders so that we can come up with something with workable and we continue to have a good working relationship with the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cruzen, followed by Fleming.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. My name is Maureen Cruzen, and I'm with Verizon Wireless, and I came here tonight because I wanted to express our appreciation for the opportunities we've had to date to work with staff and the opportunities that we've had to develop workable solutions to serve our customers that were mutually beneficial to the city and to Verizon. We are very much appreciative of that. And I will also say there are many residents and there are many businesses in the city of Palo Alto who depend on Verizon and other carriers' wireless networks, and some that are very much looking forward to the advent of 5G and all of the possibilities that will be offered by that. And we would like to let you know that we are committed to continuing to work and partner with the City of Palo Alto and with the staff to come up with designs and guidelines and ordinances that will result in continuing to be able to provide that world-class service. But I would like to reiterate Mr. Albritton's statement that we would ask you tonight to not adopt this ordinance. Please defer acting until we can have an opportunity to allow input from all the stakeholders and get some feedback and come up with something that is really workable and genuinely deployable. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this Jeannie? Ms. Fleming?
Fleming, yes.
Followed by Ms. Chow.
And I'm correct that I have 3 minutes, yes?
That's correct. You have 3 minutes.
I apologize. I think I have about 2 paragraphs longer than that. May I be permitted to try to squeeze it in?
Do your best.
Okay. I'll talk fast. I have some photographs.
Is this the one? Have the time start when her visual aids are ready.
Okay, thank you. Needs to be rotated.
And
There we go.
Yeah, just, and maybe it makes sense, Rebecca, if I just tell you when to go to the,
Next slide, yeah.
okay. And also, Rebecca, I'm going to go from the first slide to the third slide. Okay.
We'll
Good
try to
evening.
keep up.
I'm Jeannie Fleming, here on behalf of United Neighbors. Let me say at the outset that we love our smartphones, and our goal is not to prevent telecom companies from providing good service here. Our goal is to ensure that the aesthetics and safety of our neighborhoods are not compromised in the process. Last December, City Council unanimously passed a wireless resolution, the intent of which is to keep ugly, noisy, and potentially hazardous equipment like this, that's what I'm talking about, away from homes. The purpose of the changes and additions in the revised wireless ordinance, which you're considering this evening, is to spell out how to implement the provisions in the resolution, provisions that stipulate where cell towers can be located and what they can look like. So, for example, they say that cell towers can be placed in residential areas only if the city grants an exception, and that if equipment such as radios can't be side-mounted on poles like that, unless, again, the city grants an exception. I'm here tonight to ask you to recommend to council that they adopt this ordinance, this revised ordinance. I'm also here to ask you to recommend that council adopt 4 additional revisions to the ordinance. I'll speak about 2 of them. First, please recommend to council that all requests for exceptions be reviewed by the Architectural Review Board. Why? Because aesthetics are the grounds on which municipalities have legal authority with respect to cell towers, and the ARB is the arbiter of aesthetics in Palo Alto. If our city is to preserve the character of its neighborhoods, it needs the imprimatur of the ARB to support its decisions. Moreover, ARB members are architects. They know how to build things. Hence, if anyone is qualified to determine whether, say, Verizon truly cannot vault equipment underground at a particular location, it is these experienced professionals. So please, recommend that all requests for exceptions to our city standards be reviewed by the ARB. Second, please recommend to council that they increase the minimum setback for cell towers from residences. Okay, photo number 3, please. Here's a photo of a tower of boxes that's 20 feet and 1 inch away from a Palo Alto home. That's how close to a house the revised ordinance allows a company, once granted an exception, to put a cell tower. That's a distance just a little bit greater than the length of a Tesla. How can this possibly make sense? The aesthetic problem, I think, is obvious, but also consider this. Where's a 55-foot tall utility pole, top-heavy with multiple antennae, because they will have multiple antennae? Where's this pole going to land when it's toppled by an earthquake or a windstorm? Homes only a few short feet away are a good bet. Then there's the health risk associated with living in close proximity to the radiation emitted from these towers. I will only point out on this front that today's London Financial Times reports that Switzerland has, and I'm quoting, halted the rollout of 5G over health concerns. If the country of Switzerland is so concerned about the health risks these towers pose that it imposed an indefinite moratorium, which is what they did, shouldn't Palo Alto be concerned as well? setback of 20
Please
feet
try to wrap up, Ms. Fleming.
is short-sighted, and it should be increased significantly. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Ms. Chow?
Good evening, everyone. I live in Barron Park, and I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. I've been actively involved in issues around our wireless ordinance for quite a while now, and I'm quite pleased to see us moving in the right direction. I'm very thankful for the many helpful conversations with city staff, and there are a number of truly excellent elements that have been added to the ordinance. I encourage you to strongly support the proposed changes in the staff report. We've really made significant progress in creating a strong wireless ordinance for our beautiful city, following the model of many, many other cities in California and across the country. I agree with the suggestions raised by Jeannie and the many others who have written to you, and I will focus my comments on two specific issues. My main suggestion is to move the location preferences from the resolution into the wireless ordinance itself. This will create a coherent and a robust document in the wireless ordinance. I've spent a lot of time reading ordinances from other cities, and they all include the location preferences in the ordinance itself, and they have a separate section in the ordinance called Site Location Guidelines. They may or may not then have additional objective standards to cover minor details, but the location guidelines are in the ordinance. I believe that these location preferences therefore apply to all cell towers, both on private property and in the public right-of-way. You can imagine scenarios where small cells or macro cell towers are proposed on private property immediately adjacent to our secondary schools, for example. We would want to apply the same setbacks from schools and homes and the zoning preferences that we have in the right-of-way in those situations as well. And one way to do that is to create a separate section called Site Location Guidelines for all cell towers, including the full range of possible cell tower applications. I'd also like to see an increase in the setbacks in the current standards related to schools. The Palo Alto Unified School District School Board continues to request a 1,500-foot setback from schools, and this is based on a resolution that they passed in June 2019. And their resolution was based partly on observations that an increasing number of public agencies at all levels are raising concerns about and taking action to protect against cell tower radiation. Right now, we have a 600-foot or a 300-foot setback by exception in the current standards. And I would suggest that in addition to increasing that distance, that the setback should apply to all public and private schools and daycare centers. Right now, the standard only says that it's for public schools. So to summarize, please support the proposed changes to the wireless ordinance, including moving the location guidelines to the ordinance to create a strong, robust document that reflects the values of our city to the fullest extent possible. And also please reconsider the setbacks from schools and from homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last call for public comment. Okay. Ms. French? Thank you. All right. Mr. Grabish.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. I am here on behalf of AT&T, and to reiterate some of Paul's comments that, you know, we worked very closely, I think, a year ago with the city to develop the design standards.
Excuse me. Please keep order.
What's that? Oh, better with the mic?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you're fine. There was some noise interfering with your comments, so we're
Okay.
going to restart the clock.
Sorry. So as I was saying, a year ago, just about a year ago, we worked very closely with the city to come up with reasonable and responsible design standards that provided the best aesthetic that the technology has to offer today. And, you know, we worked very closely on coming up with these standards so that we based applications on those standards, which we were very happy with, and we're appreciative of the staff's input, you know, allowing us to have input to show the best that technology has to offer. Within the last year, by December, it was, you know, a surprise to us, as Paul said, that a lot of these standards, a lot of the applications that we currently have before you would now require exceptions. That every single application, just about with the new standards that the city is proposing, is going to require an exception, and these are going to become effectively prohibiting our ability to provide services. Applications being deemed withdrawn. With those new standards that were adopted, there were a lot of things that still needed to be revised and worked through as far as different interpretations of attachment heights and things. 90 days is not enough time to even go through some of the issues that could arise through a deemed incomplete notice that's given in an application. So I urge you to reconsider adopting this standard. Let us work together to come up with, again, a more reasonable and responsible way that we can actually deploy facilities and not be effectively prohibited or have an unduly burdensome time on staff resources and, carrier resources to come up with the applications to meet the standards that the city is currently considering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Commissioners, if you would like to ask questions or have comments, light up your buttons. Okay, so let's start with, is it Commissioner Rupavar? Vice Chair Rupavar?
Yes. Thank you, staff and public, for comments. I had a procedural question that I was hoping you can help me out with. So in December, it said, your slides say the City Council clarified certain objective standards, correct? So they adopted, let me explain what I'm trying to get at. What is at issue before us? What was adopted in December, or only these amendments? Because when I'm hearing comments from council for the telecommunications provider, it sounds more broad, and I want to know, are we now opening up what was decided in December, or are we only focusing on the amendments and what you went through and those specific items?
It's a great question. What's before you tonight is amendments to the ordinance. And so what was before council, contrast in December, was a resolution. We also have our city attorney who's been working a lot on this, who can explain more, but essentially the resolution, this ordinance tonight is looking at, is going to go into our municipal code. And so as Rebecca mentioned, for a number of items, part of it is taking practices that we have and codifying it. And as you saw in that graphic where the ordinance is in the center, that center cog of that multiple kind of cog system, that applies to all wireless facilities, whether they're in the right-of-way or whether they're on private property, and obviously different parts of it govern different facilities. So that's what's before you this evening. And then you can also see in that graphic the objective standards, which were amended in December through ordinance, which apply primarily to facilities that are in the right-of-way. Hopefully that helps clarify what you're considering.
Okay. I had one more question. If the setback requirements are changed, increased from what is in the proposed amendment right now, would that have an impact on feasibility of where telecommunications devices can go? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, if you increase the radii, is that going to cause effectively these telecommunication devices can't go anywhere?
Yeah, so to kind of give a little background on the ordinance or the resolution that was passed, and as Rebecca said, the location preferences are not included in the ordinance before you. They are part of the resolution. The resolution was provided as an attachment, so you can again get that overall kind of framework of the regulatory framework for wireless facilities in Palo Alto. So within that framework in the resolution, part of what we did to get to the number of, what is the setback requirement, was to do some analysis with GIS to kind of look at different scenarios, to experiment with different radii to say, okay, if we increase it to this or decrease it to that, what does the map of Palo Alto look like? How much of the city becomes either needing an exception, or if it's a hard kind of line saying you cannot even request an exception, are we making it infeasible for cellular service providers to have a functioning network in Palo Alto? And so when we looked at the hard line being at 20 feet, we felt comfortable and confident that we could propose that as a no-go zone for wireless facilities and still provide the carriers with enough land, enough area to have their network. Obviously, you've heard testimony that they disagree with that, and that's certainly reasonable. People can disagree, but that's how we got to that number. And if we go beyond that number, we do run into either one, needing to allow an exception to that distance. And so sure, we could say 100 feet, 200 feet, but you can ask for an exception. And so we decided to draw a smaller circle, 20 feet, a smaller distance, but say that is no exceptions are allowed within that 20 feet. Rebecca, do you want to add anything to that, or did I get it right?
You got it right.
She's been tutoring me.
Just for clarification, the distance, the siting standards that include location, distances, and so forth, they're already incorporated into this ordinance before you tonight. So there isn't a need to, establish location preferences or distances and so forth for projects in the right-of-way, because it's already incorporated, that resolution's already incorporated by reference in our ordinance. Secondarily, our ordinance already also says this, and this is from a long time ago even, that the preferences for location on private parcels, privately owned parcels, as well as publicly owned parcels, is for these wireless facilities to be on buildings, mounted on buildings, and also to be co-located where there are already existing wireless locations. So the staff believes that those location preferences are also well established already.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Any other questions and comments? Commissioner Suma.
And I want to thank the public, too, who worked with staff, because I think we got to a much better place with their participation and their interest in this issue. I did have a couple questions, and one is about, so these are all towers, right? We're not talking, all of this is for towers, not for other types of installations, like underground? Is that?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by tower.
Or poles.
Right. The ordinance pertains to all applications, all wireless facilities that require an application. So it could be the ordinance would apply to applicants that are requesting to sub out antennas and put on new antennas on an already existing facility. It could be pertaining to locating an antenna on top of an existing wood utility pole. It could pertain to creating a new wireless facility on, say, a hotel. And so it's all different kinds of wireless applications.
And just to clarify, it's for public right-of-way and private land?
Correct.
Yes. And is there something in the ordinance that regulates removal of obsolete equipment in a timely fashion? It was a member of the public brought that up, and I couldn't find it.
Yes, that currently exists, and if you give me a moment, I can find the ordinance section for you. That provision of removal of abandoned equipment was put into effect last year.
Thank you very much. And then I'm wondering about having the location preferences in a separate resolution and not as part of the ordinance, and if staff could comment on the upside or downside of that. And I'm thinking about a recent problem with a planned community where project where the ordinance didn't contain the penalty fee. It was in a different document, and it became kind of a problem for enforcement. So could staff comment on that?
So I think overall, and I will invite, Rebecca and for Eileen, our city attorney, to comment on this. I think there's a strategy around how to make sure that we can, with our ordinance, make sure, you saw a trend toward codifying things, making sure it's really clear for things that we're currently doing, we've been doing, want to continue to do. It's clear for the applicants, it's clear for the community, what are the codes that they have to comply to. And I think that's a really good thing. We also want to make sure that we have flexibility to be nimble as a city to react to different things, whether it's changes in case law, changes in federal or state law, and be able to take advantage of opportunities as they are arising. So by having the location preferences in the resolution versus the ordinance, it does allow council to move a bit more quickly if needed to be able to react and to update those preferences. So that was part of our rationale. I don't know, Eileen, if there's anything further you'd like to say about the distinction between the resolution and the ordinance, pros or cons or anything? I think that's the main one.
So having it be in a separate document in the resolution doesn't weaken the city's ability to enforce it, in your?
No, I don't believe that's an issue.
Okay.
Excuse me. To get back to you on your question, removal of abandoned equipment is an existing subsection in our ordinance, and it was renumbered in this proposed set of amendments, but you can find it as an existing part of our ordinance, subsection Q.
What packet page?
Packet page 140.
Thank you very much. Let's see. I think that's, oh, I did want to ask about the distance from residences, and I have a question about whether it should be all residences or just residential zones? Because we have a lot of residences, and we want more that are in mixed-use and business zones. So I was wondering if that would be advisable, if we would apply the same standards to a residential use that may not be in a specifically residential zone. And with regards to the distance, the 20-foot setback currently required, I believe that in the hearings at the City Council, the Director of Planning had stated that it could be much further and still there would be a feasible coverage and the wireless providers would be able to site things where they wanted them. I think he even might have stated 40 or 50 feet instead of 20. So I'm just wondering about that, because it's a concern for a lot of members of the public. We received a lot of email about this. So the setback being more than 20 feet is something I'd love to hear you comment on.
Great. So I'll ask Ms. Atkinson. Looks like she's ready to answer your last question first around the distances, and then we can return to the previous question.
You might have seen this slide from the City Council meeting in December, and it highlights just an example part of the city. If you can see the existing wood utility poles and streetlight poles on just a typical street, and you can see where there are building footprints. And the dots represent a 20-foot radius, and so you can see that some poles are within 20 feet of an existing residence, and some poles are not. Now, if you expand the radius to 100 feet, you can see how many residences are within that radius from an existing pole in the right-of-way. So there isn't much change to the circles. You can tell if you just, mentally cut half of the radius of that circle to say 50 feet, you can still see that many, many residences are still within 50 feet. So 20 feet, 30 feet starts to really exclude quite a number of existing poles. So
I'm sorry, I just don't understand the slide. Could you translate that into a benefit? I mean, is coverage going to be better or worse, or is it just a visual?
Yes, this is just a visual showing the different, like if you were to establish a minimum setback of 20 feet, which is what they did for, which is what council did in December, you can see that some existing poles are closer than 20 feet to some residences, in which case those poles are not available under the current resolution for location of a wireless facility. You can see other poles are 20 feet away. If you look at the image on the left-hand side of the slide. If you look at the image on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a 100-foot radius from existing streetlight poles and wood utility poles in the right-of-way. And you can see how this radius excludes most poles from being able to be located. So that's why we went with the 20 feet. And if you could see, if we established a 30-foot setback, you could still see that it would have more or less the same effect as the 100-foot setback.
Commissioner Zuma, can you restate your first question? I think that it was regarding the distance as well. Or did we answer that question? All right. I think the first part was about whether we should be establishing distances from residential uses that are not exclusively in residential zones. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. I think something that we started thinking about when we were establishing this was trying to think about the future, and also trying to balance between existing maybe mixed-use neighborhoods, mixed-use developments that exist. And so, Rebecca, do you want to speak to the decision to have it residential uses versus zones?
Currently, the resolution states that an exception is not required for wireless placement in a non-residential zoning district. So an exception would be required for proposed placement in residential zoning district. If you flip to the second page of the standards, there is a new standard: a wireless facility shall not be placed closer than 20 feet from any building used for occupancy in any zoning district. So if you're proposing to be closer than 20 feet in a non-residential zoning district, you still need to apply for an exception. So both existing buildings in residential and non-residential districts have that setback. In the case of residential zones, no wireless facility would be allowed, no exception would be granted to be closer to an existing residence in an existing residential zoning district. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. And then I still don't quite understand this slide, and this slide? It sounds like one of the reasons you want to keep it at 20 feet is to take full advantage of co-locations, which kind of, is that, am I understanding that correctly?
I think, well, I'm not a wireless expert in terms of the facility. I think co-location typically would occur on building and rooftops, not necessarily co-locating equipment from multiple carriers on the same pole. Would that be unusual?
I think it would be more usual to have co-location on buildings.
Yeah.
I think there are a few instances where we might have co-location on an existing streetlight pole. For example, the original design for the Crown Castle and Verizon project downtown, that original design had two carriers on it.
So this graph is showing on the 20-foot setback. These are, I believe, streetlight and utility poles. That's the color differentiation between the two, and then showing the 20-foot radii around those poles to say, okay, you can see, for example, on Fulton Street, some of those radii bubbles bump up against the front of those building facades, so those may not be eligible for wireless facilities because they're too close to buildings. And then on the right side, you see that when you blow up the radius to 100 feet, then you are really saying, well, where can the wireless facilities locate? Essentially, no poles in that example set of blocks are eligible for wireless facilities to be located there, or we have to say that they are eligible for an exception from the 100 feet, because in order to say that we're not making it infeasible. But if we're saying, well, hey, 20 feet, that's the line, no exceptions even to that, we still believe that we're allowing enough poles where carriers could propose to put facilities, but at the same time being able to hold true to that. And so part of the balance, I think, for the city is, again, trying to comply with the federal regulations as well as complying with our community's desire to ensure that our streets remain aesthetically pleasing, and so trying to balance those interests in the community.
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I guess what's missing for me here is any consideration of the values between 20 and 100 feet. So it's hard for me to understand that well. I think that's it for now.
Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Heckman, did you have questions?
Thank you. So I actually have quite a few comments on this ordinance, but I wanted to start sort of with the timing issue, and that is, I see in the staff report that this needs to go to council in April. Some of the suggestions that I'm going to raise here, if the commission agreed, I think would require staff to go back and look at some things and possibly bring this back to us on, I suppose, February 26 or whatever our March meeting is. And so I wanted to confirm that that's workable if that's the way the commission decides to go.
I would say that while we are hopeful that we can be expedient and get everything done to council by April, council also has respect for this body's opinion. And so the work that's before you is the work that's before you. So if it takes longer than getting back to April, then that timeline is extended. Again, this is council's request and direction to staff to come back by April, but we are fortunately acting as our own city's volition to do these updates. There's no impeding thing that is going to come. Well, you never know, but nothing right now that's external that's driving this other than our city's desire to be responsive to our public and to move forward this item.
Okay, thank you. So I want to start with an issue that involves a lot of different provisions, and to me it's kind of one of the key things that was troubling me, and the topic it involves is the alternatives. Which, as you know, from working on the revisions, really that concept flows through a number of provisions. I'm only going to mention 3, but recognize that every time the word alternatives is mentioned, it ties into this concept I'm going to raise. So I want to highlight 3 provisions, and the first is on page 130 of the packet. It's new section subpart 12. So this is, we're talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 permits, and what's required here for the public who doesn't have it in front of them like I do. I'm just going to read a couple sentences. The applicant shall provide an alternatives analysis that outlines the applicant's proposed primary designs, plural, and primary locations, plural, in comparison with alternative designs, plural, and alternative locations, plural, that the applicant considered, with an explanation of why the alternative designs and locations are less preferred by the applicant. So that's the first provision. And then just below that, the last sentence of subpart 13, just above the 14, says, project plans and other application materials shall be prepared for both primary and alternative locations, plural, and designs, plural. So let me give you an example that occurred to me when I read that. And it's from my experience many, many years ago, working with representatives in this industry who were trying to get an antenna approved. And I was curious as to how the engineers chose a particular location that they were moving forward. And one of the engineers explained to me, well, actually, we're in this corridor, and we actually tested 6 places along this corridor to try to get the best coverage to meet our federal mandate. And 2 of those, we got virtually no readings. 2 more were mediocre, weak. We knew we'd have to have another antenna closer. 2 were, and 1 was pretty clearly superior, and so that's the one we went with. So if one of our, so taking that language, if it's adopted, if one of our providers applies and has gone through that exact exercise, they are going to be required by our ordinance to prepare 6 entire project plans for one application when all they really want is 1, and when 2 of those, in my example, didn't even test. And that problem is compounded when we go to page 139 of the packet, which is in the findings section, I think, for exceptions. D, toward the top of page 19, which requires a finding that the applicant has provided the city with a meaningful comparative analysis with the factual reasons why all, and I'm emphasizing that word, alternative locations and/or designs identified in the administrative record are not technically feasible or otherwise not available to achieve the applicant's reasonable and clearly defined technical service objectives to be achieved by the WCF. So that provision I just read goes farther than the 6 hypothetical sites that this company considered. It's everything in the administrative record. And what that means is any person could show up and say, here's a list of 20 places that I think are a better location for that antenna. Those are now in the administrative record, and under the language of this ordinance, each one of those would be required to be analyzed, and I believe, going back to 13, you'd have to prepare entire project plans for all 20 of those. And I do not believe that was the intent. It can't be, and I don't believe it's reasonable, and I don't believe it's productive. And to me, this ordinance is a procedural ordinance. And it's trying to design, and these new amendments are trying to improve the process we go through regarding wireless telecommunication facilities. And I see two main goals of this whole process. One is to provide excellent service to our residents, our businesses, so that they have, so that their cell phones work, so that they can rely on those things. And the other, I think, primary goal is that has to be done in a way that does not contribute to visual clutter, aesthetic impacts. And so I think those are critically important. And so when I look at this ordinance, and particularly the revisions, I'm asking myself, how does this further those goals? And with this alternatives, I can't understand how it furthers the goals. To me, what I see is extraordinary additional cost to the industry, which gets passed on to the ratepayers, the cell phone owners, and I see extraordinary staff time spent reviewing 6 plans, 5 of which are going to get thrown away, or 20 plans, 19 of which are going to get thrown away. And that, of course, gets charged to the applicant, passed on to the ratepayers. So what I wanted to suggest, I wanted to borrow from CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. And again, and part of the reason I like CEQA is because it's adopted in 1975. There's a very well-defined body of law with lots of guidance on the concept of project alternatives. And I was thinking maybe we could borrow from that and have some legal support. And so what I was envisioning, and again, I know this goes no farther than my breath if a majority of the commission don't want to see it pursued, is that for these applications, let me step back. So CEQA requires a reasonable, that where a project requires an environmental impact report, there has to be a reasonable range of alternatives, and those alternatives have to be described, I had to make some notes for myself, and I'm just paraphrasing, they have to contain enough information to allow a meaningful comparison to the proposed project. So it's not a full plan set, but it's enough. And you need to understand what the goals of the proposed project are, and you're going to measure those goals against these alternatives. And so to my thinking, it seems like the way we've written these additions, we're focusing on, we want to see a different location. We want to know why this is the best location. And so I think we should require their second preferred feasible location that would reasonably meet their goals. And again, not full plans, but enough information to allow a meaningful comparison. And similarly, I think we should require an alternative feasible design for the location that they have selected. That would reasonably meet the goals of their project. And again, not full plans, but enough information to allow a meaningful comparison. So that's what I wanted to say on alternatives. Again, I think it makes it will streamline this process. It will still give us, I think, valuable information that allows us to benefit and understand why, for any project, whether it's an antenna or a tower or a base station, why the industry applicant was thinking, why they think that's the best solution. So that's one comment. So I have a number of other ones.
Do you want, at this point, I know Ms. Atkinson has indicated she would like to clarify some of the meaning of the provision that you just commented on before you move on to your other comments.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, she would like to just comment on how the
sure.
This would be implemented, just to make some clarifications that might enhance your suggestion before you move on to the other sections.
Sure.
Thank you for the comments. Alternatives are mentioned at quite a few instances in the ordinance, so acknowledged. And specifically in regard to item 12 that you mentioned, the specific wording is, you're correct, for Tier 2 and Tier 3 applications proposed for the right-of-way and alternatives analysis. And in staff experience, the alternatives analysis that applicants already do is I think your description accurately reflects staff experience where wireless carriers do go out and look for alternative locations and look for sites, and they have a lot of information already available. So generally, number 12 would be fairly easy to satisfy based on existing work that carriers already do. A distinction that I'd like to point out on number 13, though, is I think is very key relative to your comments, is that the preparation of plans and so forth are only for those applications that include exceptions. And so I think that's a key distinction, because at this point, when we receive an application and then we're required by the federal shot clock to process these applications within 60 days, we're trying to identify any alternatives in addition to the primary location that basically trying to evaluate alternatives and see how many exceptions are going to be required and have a meaningful comparison between all the different primary locations versus alternatives. And we're required to process this within 60 days. And how could we do that without full plans on some of these alternatives? So it's a question, and that's the reason why we asked for plans on the alternatives, because of these processing shot clocks that the federal government sent to staff. So I think that's an important distinction. It wasn't to be more laborious per se, it's response to these processing timelines that we have.
Thank you for that clarification. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the sentence I was concerned about in 13, the complete project plans for alternative locations, that only applies for applications that include exceptions, is that correct? Okay, but according to the staff report, that's going to be most applications, right? Because the way we have designed our system between the ordinance and the resolution with the objective standards, it's designed so that most applications will require exceptions, which means that doing these plans for the primary and alternatives will be the rule, not the exception. It'll happen more often than not. Am I understanding it right?
I think that you are accurately characterizing that many of the applications that we have at least seen thus far might require exceptions, and if the past is indication of the future, that we will see requests for exceptions accompanying them, and thus the plan set. So I can certainly see the merit of your suggestion in terms of trying to find a balance between having the applicant provide reasonable alternatives, which I think is what Ms. Atkinson is indicating, is that when we get the complete application, we really need it to be complete, because staff are not able to then go out and say, well, what about this pole? What about that pole? Why didn't you look over here? And that's often also what members of the public are curious about. Well, there's this other thing over here that's away from this house. Why are you choosing this pole? And so instead of trying to have that discussion in the 60 days, which is quite short, we need that information to come in on day one of, yeah, we looked at that pole and here's why we chose not to use that. So if you were to suggest and the commission were to be persuaded to alter this requirement to not require full plans, that we would still request that it require some type of analysis be presented to staff and thus the public, so that we could understand why other polls were not selected.
Okay, well, and I appreciate that. And I do acknowledge that this is a extraordinarily complicated issue, and decisions can't be made on this issue. I mean, well, we could decide just to move it forward, but I think that some additional consideration needs to be made, but not decisions tonight. And so we'll see how the rest of the commission feel about putting this back on staff's lap for a little bit. But let me go through my other comments, none of which, there are quite a few of them, but none of them will take as long. So let's see, let me start, and I think I'll just go through in order. Packet page 121. Paragraph D, the language we've added at the end of this short paragraph is noise, public welfare, and safety. I think that safety reference, because of the federal limitations we have, should parrot the safety language up in paragraph B, which refers to traffic and pedestrian safety, or traffic and pedestrian safety hazards. So I'd suggest you make those reference to traffic and pedestrian, because I think that's the focus. Then the next page, 122, subpart H. So the sentence starts, the purpose of this section. Well, it turns out the way this ordinance is written, this section is referring to section 1 of the ordinance, which is really just the prefatory language. So I think what you mean here is the purpose, either the purpose of section 2 below, or the purpose of section 18.42.110. So I think that would be a useful clarification. Next is page 124. In number 6, your definition, the definition of eligible support structure, which is tended to be just a restatement of the federal definition in the CFR. But actually, by adding the word existing with a capital E at the front of that definition, you've made it, it's been made to not match, it's been made to not match the federal definition. And so I think to fix it, to make it match, you get rid of existing before the word tower, and then later in that sentence where it says that exists, you change that to that is existing with a capital E, because that will match up with the federal requirement. Okay, next, page 128. So at the top of the page, we have a new subheading D, types of WCF permits required, right? And then item 1, just below that, is a permit is required in all cases, et cetera. So then when I drop down to the next subpart, which should list more types of WCF permits required, instead, there's a paragraph here that says the thresholds for a substantial change. And so it doesn't actually describe types of WCF permits required. And so when I looked at that paragraph 2, which is really what I want to focus on, I think that paragraph is just that all the provisions are fine, but they need to be moved to where they really belong. And I think that the first sentence, which is about substantial change, I think that really belongs in B13, which is back on 120, it starts on 125, where you have the definition of substantial changes or substantial change. So I would suggest moving that first sentence, importing it somewhere into subpart 13. And then the rest of that paragraph 2 on page 128, which starts the threshold for height increases are cumulative limits. I think, as near as I can tell, I think that is related to B12, which, and this was not as clear, but in B12, which starts on 124, it's the definition of small wireless facility. A lot of your height numbering was in that section, and so I think that this sentence belongs in B12. And again, the reason I care about this is as somebody who reads through these, reads through regulations and tries to advise clients, it's a trap for the unwary if you have something related to your section, but it's nowhere near your section, and I've missed it many times. So if, to the extent we can avoid that and make our ordinance easier for everybody to understand, then we should do that. Okay, next is on page 129. So subpart 8, in the last full line, you'll see the word existing with a capital E. So existing is a defined term, both in our ordinance and in the CFR. And I think pretty clear to me at one point in amending this ordinance, adding these, the red line, somebody did a global capitalize existing every time you find it. And that works in all but 3 places that I found, and this is the first one. So I think this should be a lowercase e, because the definition of existing in the CFR and in our ordinance with a capital E only applies to base stations and towers. And I don't think that's our intent here. So I think that should be a lowercase e, and I'll point out the other couple of times. And then the next paragraph down, paragraph 9, the end of that paragraph ends with the language, the WCF equipment will not generate noise. Absolute statements are one of the banes of my existence. As I'm sitting up here, my stomach is probably growling in a way that would violate this ordinance, because a lot of things make noise. If there's any electrical impulse at all in the equipment, there's going to be some level of noise. I think and I don't want us fighting where the level of noise is actually imperceptible. So from the work I've done with sound engineers, what I usually hear is 3 decibels is the lower range of what is perceptible by the human ear. And so what I would suggest here is that staff consider some very low standard that allows noise that's not perceptible to not be a violation. Okay, let's see. All right. The section that starts on page 130, at the bottom of the page, incomplete applications and applications deemed denied. So this to me is very problematic. And again, I want to start with my experience. So I work on a wide variety of projects, and I work with some very sophisticated development teams who know how to put an application together. But I would say in my experience that, and it's not it's a pretty accurate estimate, probably 90% of the applications that these sophisticated teams submit to various jurisdictions on various items, about 90% of them get kicked back at least once with an incomplete letter. It's virtually, it's not impossible, but it's remarkably hard to get everything, every detail that the city is expecting to see in the first try. And so that's why I think we have this process where you get an incomplete letter and you get some amount of time to fix the problems. And then you try to fix the problems, and hopefully, after staff review, you get a letter that says complete. But about 25% of the time that my client does that, they get a letter back with more incomplete items that should have been but were not on the first go-round. And so the problem I have with the harshness of the way this is laid out, that if an application is incomplete, then you can deny it and just make them start over with new fees, new plans. That's in subpart 2. And in subpart 3, you can deny it if staff feels that any answer would change the nature of the application. I just don't think that's the right way to go. I don't think it's a good process, and we should be striving for the best process. So I think at most, there should get at least, they should get one incomplete letter, an opportunity to resubmit, and if there's some significant problem with the second application, then I think you look at some more harsh remedies. But I think this, again, from my perspective, it's not good or fair. So I would strike 2 and 3, possibly substitute some language after the second, after the first incomplete letter comes back. But if you didn't want to do that, then really you've got the whole subpart G, because then all that's left is if they turn in something that's not complete, you give them a letter saying what's not complete, and you're already doing that anyway. Okay. not many more. On page 132, so actually this begins on 131. This concept of an independent expert, I think it's typical across many kinds of development where technical reports are submitted by an applicant and the city wants peer review. They want an independent peer review, and I think that's entirely appropriate. And I think a lot of this I think a lot of these subparts are entirely proper and describe that. But when we get to item I, if applicable, rebuttal evidence. So these are the things that the director can go look for in an expert. If applicable, rebuttal evidence to the conclusions reached or claims made by the applicant. So when I read that, to me, that presupposes an outcome. In other words, the director has received reports and wants a contrary report. And so then you're going to end up shopping for a consultant who will give you a contrary report. And I don't think that was really intended here, but it invites that. It invites it. And I don't think we need it because the item above it is an assessment of the validity of the applicant's conclusions, reached or claims made, and that's where your independent expert, if their opinion is that the applicant's conclusions are invalid, will tell you why with evidence. So I think it's already covered, and I just think it's not good language to have in an ordinance because it invites bias. All right, at the bottom of that page 132, and this is actually something that I just wanted to mention because it was raised in nearly all of the letters from the public that we saw, and that is a desire that for Tier 2 permits, which are on page 132, and then again for Tier 3 permits, instead of the director may refer to the ARB, the suggestion was made that should be changed to shall, so from the permissive to the mandatory. And I just wanted to respond to that because I understand the concern. I personally think that may works better here, and the reason is, again, this applies to every application to which an exception is requested. And not all of those exceptions will involve design issues. Some of them will, but some of them won't. And as to the ones that won't, I don't see any benefit in convening the ARB to hear about some non-design issue and make a decision on it. So, and even if it does have a design aspect, the director's going to decide whether, I should really turn this over to a panel of experts. But to me, the ultimate protection for the neighbors would be the right to appeal to the city council. So if it's a design issue and the director rules and approves and people don't like it, they can appeal to the city council. And when they get to city council, they can say, this should really go to ARB. And if the council agrees, it will. So I think that there's good protection. I like the flexibility of this aspect of the ordinance. So I would leave it as is, understanding the concerns of the neighbors, but thinking that those are protected. All right, two more. Let's see, page 134. New subpart 10, third line, there's a capital E existing. This is another one of those places where I think it should be lowercase. And then I think the last one I have, where is it? Yeah, on page 135, same issue. In subpart 3, the fifth line, at the end of that line, with other existing with the capital E, I think you intended a lowercase e there. So thanks for bearing with me, everybody.
Is that all, Commissioner Hickman? No, thank you very much for that detailed feedback. I'm sure that staff will find that very helpful. Commissioner Vice Chair Rupivar.
Just two quick comments. I don't want to get into wordsmithing or anything like that, but it's going to be super quick. I appreciate your comments, Commissioner Heckman. I think that setting the standard for locations based on reasonable location and reasonable submission of evidence versus actual hard plans is going to invite litigation and confusion. Again, I base that on my years of experience litigating. I think it's better to have something clear-cut in terms of what needs to be done, or based on your practice and procedures. That would just be my opinion. And then one minor point on packet page 121, where Commissioner Heckman said that we need to modify Section D to say traffic and pedestrian safety standards. I disagree with that because Section B refers to safety generally, and thereafter goes into including and gives traffic and safety as an example, not as like all-encompassing. I think my third question, which would be helpful in my mind in deciding whether we need more time or not, would be directed to the city attorney. The comments that Commissioner Heckman raised, and tell me if this is not a fair question, because I know this is all being thrown at you. Are there corrections that now you feel need to be made, or do you feel that those were suggestions as to different, like subjective opinions as to how it should be? Do you feel you need to fix this ordinance? Like, did you feel that you need additional time? Like, were there errors? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Withdraw. If it's confusing, I can withdraw it.
Well, it makes sense, but I want to know there are a number of comments that were
You're like, yeah,
there were
there's
a number
lot.
of comments that were suggested, and I think we haven't heard from the commission support. We just heard from the vice chair some support for some opposition to others. Some, like typographical errors, capital E, okay, that's minor. Some were substantive, and I think we would need to know some direction.
Okay, that's fair.
And have clear direction. I don't know, Sandy, if Eileen, you want to go into more detail, but it depends, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask Eileen Buller from my office to further respond. She's been working on this matter.
Yeah, and I will say there was, to meet the council timeline, a push to get this in front of you quickly. So, you can always do a better job with more time. I don't know if commission thinks we should be spending more time and really doing more wordsmithing, but I will say from our perspective, this was sort of a first cut to get your input. We're certainly happy to go back and do additional review.
No, I don't have any more questions.
Yeah, it's not on, but Commissioner Lowing. It's not working. Yeah. There we go.
The one at that end worked differently, so I'm adjusting to my new chair. So I actually have a number of comments as well, and I do have, I would say, without a JD, I'm discounting it that way, but I do have a sort of substantial agreement with some of the issues that Commissioner just raised here. So one of the, I wrote down at the beginning of my comments, questions for tonight, to begin with, what are the issues that are being expressed by the applicants that you were trying to address with this? And, sort of some war stories from the field. Is it around application process or in feasibility? But hearing some public comment, I'm now concerned that maybe there wasn't a lot of input from the applicant. And so with respect to this idea that's been floated about, maybe more time, there were some, excellent comments from Verizon and AT&T on one side, but there were also some excellent comments from a couple of public folks there of changes to this that, we're kind of hearing for the first time. So I think there's some merit to that. This is a very complicated issue. Unlike the previous item, this is not going on consent calendar when it leaves here to go to council. And I personally have said for 3 years that getting a complicated ordinance, reviewing it and approving it in one night is not a good thing. I don't believe that's good for the public. I don't believe that's good for PTC because we have to have credibility in our recommendations. Now, having said that, I don't want to go too far down that because these are substantive amendments, not the total ordinance. and we've been requested by, council to get these and move it along. So this idea of pause and discussion, I think if there's agreement here and it's not, a fire drill, I think that would be preferable. This does go to council, and I think we should try to have it as right as we can get it. On the other hand, this is a complicated one that they're going to have to take on at their level. So then a number of questions overall that I had, without referring to the code, actually touched on a number of the things that Bart did there. So let's see, a couple of these have already been answered, of course. Yeah, all these comparisons in terms of the alternatives, I can understand why you have some alternatives, but the way that it was stated colloquially here, why are you going to put it on that tree and not one of these other 12 trees? It seems like there could be some limitations for everybody's benefit, staff and so on. I mean, we're going to be having to add a lot of staff, which costs the city money, or we have to hire consultants. If there was some way to constrain that and still get to the essence of what we're trying to accomplish, I think that would be much preferable. I'm not going to make some of these comments I made notice of earlier. Who, in the infeasibility and exceptions and alternatives, is it the planning director that ultimately makes the kind of final decision on this? Each one of these obviously only goes to council and
The final decision that location is infeasible, or?
Location and design and so on.
So I think that, in an ideal situation, I don't know if it's ideal, but my understanding is that the applicant would come forward, let's say they needed to request exceptions, they are requesting at the beginning of their application process, we are proposing it on this pole in the right of way, based on this pole's location, it needs these exceptions, and based on our design of our antenna, it needs these exceptions. And so ideally, we're knowing that going in, that these exceptions are being requested. And then in terms of who's the final sign-off on that exception, the staff would review it, and then I believe the director would sign off on that exception request. Is that correct, Rebecca?
The director would review the exception request in accordance with the findings that are listed in the current ordinance, and also the findings that are subject to discussion tonight in the proposed amendments.
And then if
There are
there's,
detailed findings for exceptions.
and then they would be appealed to the city council.
Right, and I noticed that much later in the report, it was also one of my comments, is that it says that an individual can object, so a resident can object to the approval, and with one resident objecting, it has to go to council. It's just another
That's
area.
correct.
It's just another area that, unless that's a state law, it seems like obviously the public should have full access to city council, but maybe it's not one person. Maybe it's a petition of 20 or something. But if that's controlled by, is that controlled by state law, or is that just what you guys put in there?
I don't believe it's state law. I believe it is consistent with other local practices that we have in terms of who is eligible to request an appeal.
I didn't hear the first part of that sentence.
It's not required by state law to my knowledge, but it's consistent with other parts of our local code that allow any person to file an appeal. Some might see it as very liberal, which could be a good thing, or could be a downside.
I would feel that that's worthy of debate, because we're just gonna, you're gonna spend a lot of time on that, and council's gonna spend a lot of time on that, so.
Certainly true.
All right, just a couple more. That was that one. So I guess back to the first comment that I made is, do you feel like you have had enough input from applicants to make decisions that in many cases are going against their requests? So I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just saying, do we have the feedback there?
Commissioner Lowing, I think in light of your other comments in terms of, this is a complex issue that we want to not just move along just because, and certainly we want to be responsive to council, and it'd be great to get back with them by April, certainly before their break for summertime. However, this body did choose to see this ordinance again. We could, in that intervening time, reach out to project sponsors and applicants and get additional feedback from them if they feel that they have not been heard in this process.
If that happened, I'm not envisioning a year process of discussing. but just so that, you know, parties are heard, and so that other parties can object and say, no, this is not what it makes sense, because you folks are going to be making the final decision to bring to us and to bring to council. So that said, a couple of things that I'll just quickly reiterate what Bart said. The incomplete applications denied, I think that's unusually harsh. Just get it fixed. Maybe even applications withdrawn after 90 days. That could be a little bit longer. And the alternatives analysis, he covered in great detail. So I would be amenable to supporting seeing this again, which is what Bart's suggesting. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to make some comments now, I think, if you're all ready, done. So first, I want to thank Ms. Atkinson for preparing this very detailed, thorough presentation and engaging our commissioners so effectively. I think that has definitely got all of our attention, and I hope that the feedback is useful. I found it quite interesting. I went through, as I was reading the letters that came in from the public and from potential applicants, from residents, also while listening to the commissioners, and I marked with a highlighter all the sections that were up for discussion. And it's significant, and I think it's you know, we can look at it like, oh, you know, yeah, we got to have another revision, but it's also a gift because, you know, many of the people that provided comments are trying to look ahead at how this would be applied and what kind of challenges we can avoid by changing the phrasing or tweaking the language a bit. So I think, you know, I'm agreeing with the sentiment I'm hearing from the other planning commissioners up here that we might appreciate another revision, and despite the fact that council has provided an aggressive timeline for this, they may appreciate some of the changes that you make if we were able to still get it before summer break. It sounds like some members of the community would appreciate that too. Some questions I have answered, since we do have this slide up, is do we know how is the requirement phrased in terms of what portion of land should be available? Is it like what percentage of poles should be available? What percentage of land is eligible, whether it does or doesn't have a pole on it? How is the language there phrased?
In terms of the language that we're trying to comply with from the federal government, it is, and I'm not going to quote exactly right, but essentially we can't make it infeasible, impractical for a wireless carrier to establish a functioning network. And so to some degree, it's up to the experts. Like, we don't know what it takes to have a functioning network, but what we do know based on experience and what the wireless carriers have indicated is that they need to have a certain number of, you know, antenna in certain proximity to their carriers. And right now with the 5G technology, and some applicants are rolling that out, and not every cell antenna is a 5G. There's a greater number of antenna in closer proximity, and then it's actually improving service. And so that's part of the reason that we have some of the sections around hiring experts and making sure that we can understand why something is being proposed, you know, is it infeasible, and also the requirements around showing why these other poles, it doesn't work for them to have it at those locations, so we can understand that requirement.
And sort of, I would add probably to address the fast-changing technology that may change from year to year. Okay. Okay, that's really helpful. So in general, you know, I think that a lot of the feedback from the public has been incorporated. I'm very happy to see that. I agree that it would be useful to revisit some of the feedback from potential applicants, and regarding the one person being able to take it to council, point that Commissioner Lowing brought up, I was thinking maybe a scenario might be that a particular property was affected, and that person may need the right to escalate it. So there are cases in which it would make sense. So I'm okay with that language. If it becomes, if it starts to look like it's being abused, of course, council would have the authority to modify this, right? So that's the extent of my comments. So is there anyone who wanted to pursue the staff recommendation at this point, or are we comfortable asking for another revision? Commissioner Suma.
So I'm comfortable, because it seems like that's where my majority of my colleagues are going with, asking for another revision. I appreciate the very detailed comments from Commissioner Heckman. And I think, typos and the capital E issue is those are kind of different. I have a strong preference, however, for also incorporating a stronger language about the director shall send to ARB. I think this could become, I think that going to the ARB gives the public a right before a decision is made to have a public hearing where they can opine about it. I think mostly it probably will be the case that it goes very quickly at ARB, sort of like a consent calendar item. But there may be cases where that's the public's only chance to really publicly, in a public hearing, to opine about this. And I would also like to see a consideration of the distance from residences. I'm like I said earlier, I'm missing the values that exist between 20 and 100 feet that may be more satisfactory to many members of the public. And also with regards to the distance from schools, we also have the PAUSD opining about that. So in addition to the typographical errors and some of the concerns, I would like those 3 items specifically to be looked at, and maybe also look at incorporating the standards into the ordinance itself. I would like more information about that. Thank you.
So I think I'm really grateful for all the feedback that we've received. I do want to note some of it is at direct odds with each other. So in terms of direction, for some of these items, we don't have clear direction. So if the commissioners do have motions to make on certain items in terms of directing staff to do something or to not do something, that would be helpful. For example, Commissioner Snuma wants it to be may go to ARB. Commissioner Heckman had the opposite opinion, and so staff will come back with essentially the same thing we have today, and you have to debate the merits of either of those options. So I don't necessarily want to, I mean, it's only 8 o'clock, it was early, but to the degree that you feel comfortable weighing in and opining and deciding tonight would be great. Again, some items will just simply come back with the same recommendation because the direction is none here, in my opinion. So if there are items that are clear.
We could take simple votes on those that are I mean, not with 0 discussion, but not with an hour each on each of these points. So you have more, so if it's a 5-1 or what do we have?
And then some items that obviously are things we can
whatever.
show. For example, the distances, we can provide the analyses that we performed to show what would happen with the greater distances so that you have better information regarding why that was the conclusion.
Commissioner Heckman?
Thank you. So I understand the dilemma. The comments I made tonight were suggestions, my views. And as far as I know, staff may or may not have had that dialogue internally. And so what I was trying to convey tonight was not necessarily make this change, as much as I think this change should be made, and I'd like staff's considered response to that. And that really applies to every comment I made except for the one on page 121, which I agree with Commissioner Rupavar that the safety language doesn't need to be added because she's correct. It really reflects the broad one. So we can ignore that. But so that was what I was envisioning, and I'm not sure if we get there by motion to direct staff to basically take our input and come back with your comments on these issues. And frankly, the issue that Commissioner Suma and I have differing views on, what that does is, I think, highlight for you that we both need to understand a little bit better what staff is thinking, why it's in the ordinance this way. And then we may get to a point in our next meeting where we vote to keep it one way or change it. But I think that would be helpful. The other point I want to make, just to clarify, my understanding is the distance of WCF from a house, that 20-foot figure, is contained in the objective standards. And the distance from schools is contained in the objective standards. And those are not before us tonight. Those were adopted by the council in December, and we can't change those here. I think that those are very valid points to bring up with the council if people are dissatisfied with that. But the most we could do here is write into the ordinance something that would conflict directly with what's in the adopted operating objective standards. And we can't do that. You have to have what's called horizontal consistency among your regulations. So I don't think we can tackle those two issues in the objective standards unless we are also reopening, we can't tackle those in the ordinance unless we are also reopening the objective standards.
That makes sense to me. Chair Templeton, if you would like, we can respond to some of the comments that the commissioners have made this evening. I think many of these items staff have considered and have put thought into the recommendations here. So if that is the intent of some of the comments, was to receive discussion, we can entertain that discussion. If the intent was for us to go back and think some more, I mean, again, some of them we would need to sharpen our pencils, but some of them we have considered. Not sure what the direction is this evening.
I would be happy if there were comments on some of this feedback to help us understand the context and the way you're seeing it. And I'm also happy after that to consider motions.
So I'm just I have my list here, and I can invite my colleagues to jump in as they have also comments to make, and again, trying to just promote dialogue between staff and the commission. So we did discuss the idea of whether or not, how would applicants present the alternatives. And so I think, Commissioner, you're correct, Heckman, when you say that when folks need exceptions, which might be frequently, that we're requiring a high degree of plan sets. And again, as you pointed out, the administrative record. So essentially, folks in the public might submit locations to say, why not this pole? Why not that pole? So we certainly could look at tightening that up if that is the desire of the commission, to have that be maybe a lighter touch of what it means to look at an alternative and to think through an alternative that a carrier might provide. But we also want to provide language that is equivalent. That is to say, what one carrier provides is evidence of researching an alternative is something that another carrier could provide, and thus that members of the public could look between carriers, between alternatives, and be able to understand what that is. And so we could look to try to decrease perhaps the amount of work that an applicant might have to do to provide an alternative. And we could look and think about what that might be. We covered the issue with safety, and I think Commissioner Rupavar is correct, Vice Chair Rupavar, in that regard. Regarding noise, we can look a little bit closer at the definition of noise and to ensure that, yes, many things make noise. If you turn it on, it's going to make a noise. It has a vibration. And so we would want to make sure, I think, that the definition of noise is consistent with other ways that we regulate noise in the city. When is a noise and when is it a nuisance, right? And what is that threshold and that barrier? And so our noise ordinance, I think, is pretty helpful in understanding when it becomes more than just a noise that you can hear, a sound perhaps, and when it becomes a nuisance. Rebecca, do you have any comments on that regard?
Yes, in regard to the comments on noise, that was an application requirement to submit a noise report. And the way that they wouldn't need to submit a noise report would be just to say that the wireless facility is not going to produce any noise and submit evidence of that through the manufacturer specification. So it's a way of getting out of submitting a full report by an acoustic engineer. So it was actually written in a way that was trying to not have the requirement for a noise report for silent facilities. So yes, there are silent facilities.
So for those carriers who choose to use those facilities, they wouldn't have to submit a noise report. So that's a benefit for those folks. On the notice of incomplete, I think this is a discussion area that would be of interest, I think, to staff to understand other commissioners' thoughts, and thank you, Commissioner Heckman and Lowing, for sharing your opinions on that topic. Certainly many applications that come to the planning department are incomplete when they arrive, and they require some number of documents and other assessments to become complete applications, whether it's a housing project, an office project, or a wireless facility. And so it's not uncommon for projects of any kind to get a notice of incomplete. I think one of the things we're trying to guard against is projects sitting for a year or more, a number of months, with no updates, with no actions from the carriers, with interest from the community, what's happening, what's going on, and kind of just ongoing, yeah, we'll get to that soon. So being able to have the discretion to say, okay, enough is enough, your application is incomplete, and we are actually going to say, you've got to start again. In particular, as our laws keep changing, the codes that apply to that carrier also begin to change. And so we get to points where we say, we've updated our standards, but this person filed their incomplete application on X date, what standards are applicable. And so I think it would be interesting to know more from commissioners about, if you are interested in seeing maybe that come back to be a little more specific, still allowing some discretion, but maybe a little bit more room for applicants. I think Commissioner Heckman suggested that they would get one notice and have some time period to correct, with the idea also being that the city's notice of incomplete would contain all the items they need in order to become complete, right? So we're doing our part to help them get into compliance. So if that's something that the commission is favorable to, we could certainly consider how to draft the ordinance as such. The ARB item, our ARB is certainly a talented and much-used body in our community. They meet every other week to consider projects that are coming through for planning entitlement. So we have also, and I don't know if we talked very much about this, the 60-day window to review wireless applications when they come in. And so it's a very tight window to get the application, to get everything prepared and get it to the ARB. And again, I think it was pointed out that all the consideration and exceptions may not be design-based. They may need an exception for some other part of the ordinance. And so having everything go to ARB as a matter of course would tremendously impact the amount of work the ARB has, and that some ARB members may or may not consider to be the core values or core body of the work that they are assembled to review, in that it may not have any design exceptions or kind of aesthetic related exceptions. So that would be one reason I think staff would not be favorable to moving the may to shall, as it allows, when there is a design related reason, to send it to ARB, but when there's not, it wouldn't need to go to that body. Why is it ARB also becomes somewhat of a rubber stamp if they're always getting things that they don't really have a lot to say about, but are being asked to say something? It could be challenging. In addition, running up against the 60-day clock, and I believe after 60 days, are the applications deemed approved?
It depends on the type.
Depends on the type. Okay, of course it always depends. Never a clear answer with wireless. So we wouldn't want to run into any of those issues. Just turn my page, and please stop me if you have any questions. I'm just kind of motoring through these items. And certainly one person to file appeal, I think that could be something that we've heard some commissioners speak on tonight. And then as far as Commissioner Suma, I think you wanted to know a little bit more about the radii and the distances, and while the distances are not before you in the ordinance as they are within the wireless standard, it's certainly something when we come back we can just explore a little bit more for your benefit of understanding how this ordinance fits with that other, with the resolution. I don't think it's out of the commission's purview, you could choose to ask for the location preferences to be named in the ordinance. They are included by reference. So that is the way we've done it, again, so that if the resolution gets updated, then the ordinance is automatically updated with changes to those location preferences. If the commission did want to kind of send a note or message to council that they thought that those distances were too great, we could certainly convey that message to council when we take the item forward, that you feel the resolution should be updated with shorter distances. And that could be something that they consider. We would not want the two documents to be out of sync with each other. So that's my comments. I don't know, Rebecca, if you have any further comments on any of the items that the commissioners brought up that you'd like to clarify.
Thank you. I guess in regard to the incomplete applications and the different things that, if an application was deemed incomplete, I'd like to highlight that on packet page 131, and I don't know if it changes the discussion or the sentiment shared here, but I'd like to highlight that you have subsection G, and in order to promote efficient review and timely decisions, packet page 131, the city, at its option, may take any of the following actions. So it's not to say that, if an application was deemed incomplete, that we would for sure take any of the following actions, 1, 2, or 3. It's just that the option more in these cases that Rachel described, where applications have been lingering, in some cases many years. So it's an option as opposed to a requirement for staff to take action. So I don't know if that changes the sentiment or if anybody wanted to speak to that further.
Thank you. So if we're here for dialogue if you so desire, and then really just to answer any questions and try to move ahead.
Someone to my right, was that Commissioner Lowing? Did you have a comment? And then Commissioner.
She answered the question I had.
Oh, okay, great. Commissioner Suma.
So with regards to ARB review, maybe it would be appropriate for all design issues to go to ARB then. And from what you said, I understand there's exceptions that wouldn't involve design issues, which I'm kind of curious about what those might be. But if that would be more appropriate language, I would, that would be all right. And the reason I brought up the distances and whatnot is because we had 8 slides, I think, at the end of the presentation, referring to all key modifications for the objective standards. So I thought it was something we could opine about tonight, especially since there's a chance to put those things, depending on how my colleagues feel and staff feels, to put those things in the actual ordinance. So that's why I felt it was on the table tonight.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just for clarification, we included slides that we might be referring to as we talk about the distance, because we know that's a topic of great interest. And so, again, as some visuals to explain some of the process that we went through. And we didn't use all of them, but we did use a couple of them. So I know also sometimes the visuals can be hard to see on the screen, so making sure you had a hard copy as well. In regards to the ARB, I think that's something we definitely can consider. One thing that commissioners may know, may not know, is that we do have a certain kind of pre-approved designs. And so when applicants are saying, well, we want to do a different type of design that's not part of our kind of pre-approved set, that might be something that would go to ARB. An example of something that's not design-based might be, well, we want to have it here. It's within distance of X that you said we shouldn't be within, but we're using one of the standard designs. And so it's a location decision versus a design exception that they need.
Yeah, and another thing is that directors' decisions are kind of hard for the general public to find online, and given that there's a limited amount of time to appeal director's decision, so maybe there could be a much more robust listing of directors' decisions. They're really hard to find. So, and that's the only way people would know about it then. So I would feel okay if we could also have a more robust director's decision page on our website someplace. And with regards to appeals, I think across the board, any one individual can appeal a decision, and I don't I personally don't think the standard should be different for this. So that's just my thinking on that.
Thank you. I also want to weigh in about the ARB. I would be concerned about overloading them, but I appreciate that you're thinking about it, and I know that you will process this a little bit more before it comes back to us. Notice of incomplete applications, I find your explanation of why it was presented this way to be totally acceptable. I am open to motions if people are ready. If not, we can continue discussing. Feel free to, oh, we got some lights on. Who?
It's okay, I'm okay.
Commissioner Rubenvar? Okay.
Sure. Yep.
Commissioner Heckman.
So I'm going to try a motion and then get a second, and I'll speak.
Sounds like a good strategy.
I'm going to start by turning my mic on, and then I'm going to say that I'm going to try a motion, and if I get a second, then I'm going to speak to it. So I'm going to move that staff bring us a revised ordinance addressing the comments I made, and I'll list in a moment the particular pages that I'm referencing, and bring it back to us in revised form with a staff report that is limited to just focusing on those changes that staff has continuing concerns about. In following our direction, staff has some worry, concern that perhaps we didn't see. And the pages that I'm going to reference, which again, they're all ones that I brought up before, except I'm excluding page 121, that's the safety comment. Those would be 122, 124, 128, 129, 130 to 131, 2 items on 132, 134, 135, and then the alternatives issue, which is primarily 2 places on 130 and also on 139, but the word appears in other portions of the ordinance. So that's the motion.
Any seconds?
Well, yeah, I would second that. I still want to, but I want to ask the maker a question about that. So does this leave out any of the subsets that have been discussed up here? So I know that this covers, for example, the incomplete application, but what about other things that have been discussed up here? What's not included in that? Because we're not going to go back and read these numbers here, so.
So through the chair, so the numbers I gave are the points I raised. So if someone, I'm open to adding more items from other commissioners, but that was the base list I started with. And so if there are other items to be added, I'm open to hear an amendment to the motion so we have a complete list for staff to work on.
Commissioner Lowing, did you want to continue with your second?
Yes.
Okay. And do we want the maker to have his comments and then Vice Chair Rubenvar?
There was just 2 points
2
that
points?
people had raised that weren't in your comments because I was taking notes. The first one was the radii. I don't think that was in your comments. Was it? The one with Commissioner Suma and Commissioner Templeton raised the issue about the radii and more analysis to how it was done. Were those in your comments?
It wasn't on the basis that we can't change the ordinance to change new.
That's right.
But that could be a supplement. It's not a change in the ordinance, but a sort of an explanation of why these figures are what they are. Is that what we're talking about, and what the process would be to change them?
Yeah.
To include comments on that in the staff report?
Yeah, you had both raised it, and then you explained why.
Okay.
And then the second item that I have listed was Commissioner Suma's, I hope this is helpful, comment about more robust listing of the director's decision alternatives. That was the other one that I didn't see in your comments.
And it wasn't, so I'm agreeable to amend my motion to include both of those items. An explanation in the staff report about the distance issues and whether it's an explanation in the staff report or perhaps they can find a location in the ordinance. I'm not sure where the noticing of decisions occurs. I don't remember seeing it in the ordinance, so either an explanation in the staff report of where that is and what it would take to make that more robust, or if it is part of the ordinance, then additional language to do that. So I'd do that.
All right, seconder, you agree with those changes?
Yes.
Okay, so discussion?
So I just wanted to speak to a couple of what I think are the bigger pictures. On the incomplete, really what I'm looking for there is more of something that applies when enough is enough. And again, the concern I have right now is enough can be enough just when all you've done is submit the application. Comes in, it's incomplete, that's we're drawing the line. So that's the direction I'd like to see that done. And then on the alternatives analysis, I did listen to staff, and I don't entirely understand the 60-day time constraint and how it plays into these alternatives. And so it would be very helpful to me when you come back with the staff report if that could be something that I could become educated on. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments? Commissioner Suma?
So first a question, how long does staff, with regards to this coming back to us instead of us giving you feedback to take this to council, how long does staff think it would take them to get back to us? I have a little concern about this being bogged down at Planning Commission and not going to council.
So I think that just needing to come back, so the answer is I need to look at the calendar, but I think it would be unlikely that we would come back to council before early April, and certainly maybe before May would maybe be, just because part of what we strive to do is ensure that our reports here are thoroughly reviewed before they come back to the PTC, and then for council review require even more review from various staff in the city. And so the timeline for council reports is quite lengthy in terms of when we have to get it started. So we'd want to finish the item here before we queue it up for city council. So it's already February 12th. I'm hoping we would come back here at least the second meeting in March, and then that means we may be to council sometime in May. So not far off, but it'd be a little bit of time.
Okay, and then I'd also like to ask the maker if he would be willing to incorporate the idea of all design exceptions going to the ARB.
I would be agreeable to that, with the understanding being that again, staff will comment on how they perceive whether that's a good way to go or not, because I don't fully understand the breadth of the kinds of applications that might come in. So yes, I would agree to that.
So just to clarify, we're including staff comments on how to engage the ARB based on our feedback, and then we'll be voting on that in the future. Is that correct?
Say that again.
I certainly didn't clarify that. Sorry about that. So what you're asking, Commissioner Suma, is for the staff report to include comments on how to engage, how and when is it appropriate to engage the ARB? Is that what you're asking?
So my concerns about the alternatives, I think your key concerns, I don't share those concerns about the alternatives, and I would like to make sure that some of the concerns that I have that I think have been informed by the voluminous quantity of comments we have gotten from the public get incorporated enough for consideration. I don't agree with your other comments, so I'm trying to find a way to support your motion, which has, and I'm assuming if staff finds that the alternatives are well thought out, they won't need to make the changes that you would prefer. So I don't mind that being looked at, but I want to make sure that the other concerns that I mentioned are incorporated in whatever way they can be, because I believe those are the main concerns that we have heard from the public. I don't think the public had as much interest in the administrative things that you were concerned about, and I understand that you looked very carefully at it. So I just want to make sure my other concerns, which is ARB design approval and the a more robust way to convey directors' decisions to the public, which I think is a general thing we should be doing anyway. And then my concern about the setback distances for both residential uses and the schools be reevaluated. So if you can incorporate all that in, I can support your motion.
What was the setback from school?
So on the distances, what I've offered is that in the staff report that comes back, they could further explain where the distances are located, what document, and what the process is for changing that. And I believe that's as far as we can go, given the noticing that we currently have. So if what you're looking for is that the motion includes staff to come back with language in the ordinance, changing 20 feet to some other number, or changing the 600 feet schools to some other number, or broadening the definition of schools, I'm not including that in my motion because I don't believe I can properly. And then just to be clear on the ARB issue, what I was supportive of is I thought your idea was to take the existing Tier 2 and Tier 3 provisions and really add kind of another layer. As to design issues, those shall be referred to ARB. As to any other non-design issue, that's in the director's discretion to refer to ARB.
That was my intention also based on staff's clarification.
And so I agree that can be part of my motion. And again, staff, I think, can come back and explain to us with that new language, what they come up with, the benefits or pitfalls, whatever they may be of that.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Lowing, Commissioner Rupavar?
No, I accept his second as clarified. I mean, I accept his motion. Second his motion.
Yeah, I'm supportive of your motion. Again, I view this as you're going to come back to us with whatever revised ordinance you come out with and do your own analysis, but in that staff report, go into detail as to these various issues, because I also feel uneducated at this point as to the various nuances and how the balances were struck. So I would like to see more in that staff report of why, and then better, be able to decide on the ordinance.
I'm also supportive of this motion. I'm a little apprehensive about the inclusion of shall, but as long as we have a good discussion about it when we come back and that you're willing to, share the pros and cons a little bit more in more detail, I think that would be helpful for us. Maybe include something around the lines of volume of requests and how, if we are concerned it will bog them down, help us visualize that with some data. That would be super helpful. But yeah, I think these are all great suggestions, and we'll be supporting the motion. Are we ready to vote? Yes. All in favor? And including your revision, you don't want to support it? Okay. All right. And all opposed? Okay.
And may I speak to that?
Yes.
No vote. It's not that I don't think that a lot of it was really good, but I felt that the ordinance was in question tonight, and I have a strong preference, I think, for some of the objective standards to be in the ordinance, and so I felt it was agendized and could have been considered for tonight. And the absence of that being in the motion, I just, obviously it's going to pass with the majority of you, but for the record, I think it's those are the things that concern the public the most, so leaving them out was problematic for me.
Commissioner Suma, would she be allowed to make another motion that would address the other part of the material that's in front of us, or does it all have to be included in one?
I assume she could make another motion, and if she found a second and a majority, she could, move that forward. I mean, I think in regards to whether, I guess, is the question whether or not the resolution is before us? If she was making a motion on the resolution, I do not believe the resolution has been agendized for discussion this evening.
If it's a separate matter, then that has already been voted on. So if it's something that was already discussed and considered to be part of this motion, that has already been decided. But if it's a separate matter, then the commissioner can make a motion.
So Commissioner Suma can speak to this, but my understanding is that there was some confusion here about what was before us. So do you want to speak to that and see if there's a possibility that you can have the comments you made addressed through another motion?
Sure, I can try not to take up too much time on this, though, because I think you guys have made a decision. I make a motion that there be a reconsideration of the setbacks from residential uses and from schools that be incorporated into the ordinance itself based on a more detailed analysis of options other than 20 feet and 100 feet. Anyone want a second?
That's okay. Yeah, it's fine.
All right.
That's fine.
The motion fails. Well, thank you for giving that a shot, Doria. I think that was perfectly, my understanding was that you had the right to do that, so I appreciate you guys helping clarify that and adding that to our discussion. All right, so I believe that ends our work on agenda item 3. All right, and then do we have any more discussion tonight? Looks like there's no minutes. Any committee items? Commissioner Suma.
I just wanted to remind everybody that there's a NVCAP community workshop coming up on Thursday, February 27th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. at Gunn High School, room P 115 and 116, if anybody wants to attend.
Thank you. And the NVCAP is the North Ventura work about design proposals. So that's a really interesting project. I encourage people to participate.
Yeah. Last NVCAP meeting, because I'm the PTC rep to the NVCAP, we had sort of our first proposal of 3 alternatives. So that's going to be discussed in a broader context in a community meeting.
Thank you for sharing about that. I will also add that the rail crossing discussion known as XCAP, Extended Community, I'm losing track, advisory panel, thank you, happens right now for the next few weeks, almost every week. And you can find more about that online as well. It's very interesting discussions, and we do have members of the public come and discuss about what the railroad crossing proposals how they would affect their quality of life and their commutes and things like that. So it's really good to get involved with that. All right, the rest is commissioner questions, comments, announcements, and future agenda items. So. Any other announcements? Several of you have asked about a retreat. We are looking at trying to get that scheduled for later in the spring. So nothing urgent right now and not going to pop it on your calendar at the last minute. And so we'll talk more about that in the future. I also wanted to remind commissioners, I'm trying to find the page here, that we have a schedule of upcoming meetings, and I would love to have people look ahead to the next few months. I'm specifically concerned about the first meeting in April, on April 8th, falls during the PAUSD spring break, and that people may have plans during that time. If we need to move that up or down a week to accommodate that, please let me know. And yes.
Also, first night of Passover.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the one, so we already have quite a few conflicts, so we may want to, do we need to vote to remove that from the schedule?
Maybe folks could email Vin if they're going to be absent. We can see if we'll have a quorum. If not, then we can bring that to the next meeting to cancel that meeting.
That would be super useful, thank you. And also maybe take a look into the summer if you already have plans, and do let us know so that we can get those missing dates confirmed if we don't have a quorum. And then the last thing is I would just ask the commissioners to please let me know if there are topics of special interest to you that you might want to do additional work on or dig in more as we engage with staff. Sometimes there are opportunities for us to share those interests and maybe work through and contribute to an ongoing project or discussion. So just please let me or Ms. Tanner know. Thank you.
Can I ask about future agenda items?
Yes, yes.
What is 840 Kipling? What's that issue?
It's a variance that's being requested and being challenged by a neighbor.
I see, okay. And do we have any visibility yet on the parking recommendations that council sent to us quite a long time ago?
I believe that the parking recommendations have been incorporated into, I know they were incorporated in part to the transportation work plan for last year, the end of 2019, and so I can check with the director of the Office of Transportation about what's the 2020 parking work plan look like and kind of how those recommendations are being incorporated there.
Yeah, excuse me, when he came to speak briefly to us, he said there were 35 and he was going to bring us 9.
Yeah, those are the overall, I think, and then they kind of narrowed down to the 9 things that were action items, so I can speak with him about that.
And these other 2 we've been carrying on here for a number of months, are they still current or should they be?
The to be scheduled items?
Co-working and SB 50?
Yeah, I believe my understanding, well, SB 50 maybe can be taken away unless until another SB of its same nature with a different number comes along. These were items that we wanted to have study sessions on, to my understanding. So the co-working office model, we could seek to have speakers there, especially if we do have an evening that has a light agenda. Could be a good evening to try to secure speakers. And if any of you know folks who are operating in that space who you'd suggest to be speakers, that would be helpful. But yeah, SB 50 probably can get dropped from our list.
Is this yours or mine?
That's yours.
All right. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.